My family member secretly earned $115 million from my company, forgetting one hidden contract clause could destroy everything. Let me start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the business. The beginning of Dana. Dana is my husband's younger sister. When my husband and I got married, she was in her mid-20s. Bright, ambitious, and always slightly restless. She moved through jobs the way some people move through apartments, always with a reason. Always with a story about how the last place had not appreciated her, had not seen what she could do, had not been the right fit. There was always a perfectly reasonable explanation for why she was starting over. And the version of Dana she showed you when she wanted something, the warm version, the funny one, the one who made you feel like you were the most important person in the room, that version was genuinely hard to resist. I liked her. I want to be honest about that because it matters to understand how this happened. I was not blind to her tendencies. I had watched her long enough to see certain patterns. But I genuinely liked Dana, and there was real warmth between us, not performance. At holiday dinners, she was funny and present, and the kind of person who remembered details about people and asked follow-up questions. She made you feel seen. Over the years, we stayed close the way extended family does. Holidays, dinners, long phone calls when something in her life was shifting again. She would ask about the business sometimes, not with the kind of curiosity that goes below the surface, but with a passing interest that, looking back, felt a little like reconnaissance. I did not read it that way then. I just thought she was interested in what I had built. My business had been mine for 11 years by the time any of this happened. I built it without investors, without family money, without any safety net. Every vendor relationship in that network was earned. Every operational system, every contract template, every approval process, I had put those in place myself, and most of them existed because I had already learned the hard way why they needed to exist. The conflict of interest clause was one of those things. Years before Dana ever walked into my building, I had a situation with an outside contractor who had an undisclosed financial tie to a vendor I was bringing on. Nothing as serious as what Dana eventually did, but enough to teach me what that overlap looks like when it is hidden and what it costs to unwind it without the right language in the contract. I remember sitting in my attorney's office afterward and asking him to put something in the template that would make it cleaner to handle if it ever happened again. That is where the clause came from, not from a textbook, from a lesson I had already paid for. By the time I was in my late 50s, the brand had real, consistent revenue, a staff I trusted, a vendor network I was proud of. What I genuinely needed was someone to manage that vendor side day to day so I could step back a little from the pace I had been running at for over a decade. Coordinate contracts, handle new supplier onboarding, keep the operational side clean. When my husband mentioned that Dana had just left another position and was looking for something stable, I did not say yes immediately. I took 3 weeks. I thought about her pattern, the restlessness, the short tenures, the way she had a tendency to want more authority faster than she had shown she could handle what she already had. I thought about what it would mean for my marriage if this did not work. In the end, I brought her in. Not because I had stopped thinking clearly. I believed I had structured the role carefully enough. The limits I set were real. Her signing authority on vendor contracts was capped at $25,000 per agreement. Everything above that came to me. I put that cap in her employment agreement in plain language. I walked her through our standard vendor contract template personally, sitting across from her at the conference table, and I went through the conflict of interest clause paragraph by paragraph. I told her exactly what it did and exactly why it was there. I told her no contract language could deviate from the template without my sign-off, and that any personal or financial connection to a vendor had to be disclosed before the contract was signed. Not during, not after. Before. She nodded through all of it. She asked a couple of questions that sounded like she was paying attention. She said she understood. She started in January. By April, 3 months in, Dana came to me with a request I still think about. She wanted her signing authority expanded, from $25,000 to $75,000 per agreement. She framed it the way she always framed requests for more, as a practical thing, something that would make things run faster. Her words were close to this. I keep having to loop you in on things that honestly do not need your attention. If I had a little more room, we could move faster on the vendor side. She said it easily, casually, like she was doing me a favor by asking. I remember sitting across from her and feeling something I could not quite name in that moment. Not alarm exactly. Something slower. The request looked reasonable on the outside. Plenty of operations managers carry that kind of authority. But something about the timing, 3 months in, before I had seen a single completed contract cycle under her management, before I had any real picture of how she was handling the relationships she was supposed to be building, that did not sit right with me. I told her I wanted to see a full quarter of contracts first, that I would revisit the signing limit once I had a clearer sense of her track record. She accepted that. She did not push, did not argue. She just nodded and went back to work. That was the first time I saw the old pattern in a new form. I mean, the pattern I had watched Dana run in other parts of her life for years before she ever set foot in my building. The way she framed a request for more scope, more authority, more access as something that benefited the person she was asking. She had always packaged the ask as a practical improvement for you, not just for her, and she had always been patient when she heard no. She pulled back, kept the relationship warm, and waited until the moment felt right to try again. I had seen her do this with a business partner years earlier. She came in as a junior partner in a small services firm, and within a year she had used the same framing, we'd move faster, you'd have more bandwidth, to expand her authority until she controlled most of the client relationships. That partnership ended badly. The other partner, a man I had met a few times, described it afterward as feeling like the ground had been moved under him slowly until he no longer recognized where he was standing. I thought about that conversation when Dana asked me for the authority expansion. I thought about it clearly. And then I said no and moved forward. She did not ask again. She just kept working. Over the next 4 months, May through August, Dana signed 3 vendor contracts. I want to explain exactly how she structured them, because this is the part that anyone who has ever given a family member signing authority in their business needs to understand. Each of the 3 contracts came in under my $25,000 cap, not dramatically under, carefully under. Each one was specifically structured to fall within her authorized limit, so they did not require my review, my signature, or even my awareness. They were presented internally as standard operational agreements: logistics support, inventory coordination, specialized fulfillment consulting. Routine. Unremarkable. The kind of thing an operations manager handles regularly. None of them were what they looked like. Buried in each one, in language that closely mirrored our standard template but was not our template, was a referral commission clause. The clause stated that in exchange for the vendor sourcing and bringing the engagement to the company, a 22% referral commission would be paid to a named consulting firm on all contract value over the full term of the agreement. That commission was not broken out in any summary. It was not flagged anywhere. It sat in the body of each agreement, formatted to blend in with the surrounding language. The consulting firm named in that clause was one I did not recognize. It took me looking it up in the state business registry one evening, typing the firm name into a search, to find that Dana had co-founded it 2 years before she ever walked into my office. 2 years before she asked me for the operations manager role. 2 years before she sat across my desk and nodded through my explanation of the conflict clause and told me she understood why it was there. She had never disclosed it, not in her employment application, not in her onboarding documents, not once in any conversation we had ever had. The total commission stream across all 3 agreements projected over their full contract terms was $1,150,000, structured, planned, built into 3 contracts that each fell neatly under her signing limit, executed one at a time over 4 months, designed to run quietly for years. She had thought this through carefully before she ever asked me for the role. Here is how I found out, and it was not dramatic. It was a vendor onboarding form. I reviewed new supplier documentation every quarter, not because I suspected anything. It was just something I had done since the company opened, a habit, like keeping the template folder organized, like dating every note I left for myself. 11 years of staying close to the paperwork, even when it felt routine. One evening in the fall, I was going through the onboarding forms for the 3 new vendors Dana had brought in, and I noticed one of them listed a business address I thought I recognized but could not immediately place. I set it aside. I went to bed. I came back to it the next morning. I cross-referenced it against files I had kept over the years, old vendor documents, a folder of business contacts and correspondence built up over a decade in the industry. The address on the vendor's onboarding form matched a co-working space in the same building as an address I had on file for a consulting firm Dana had mentioned to me once. Very briefly, very early in her first weeks on the job. She had called it a side project from a few years back, said it so casually, and moved the conversation forward so quickly that I had not thought to follow up. I had not written it down, but I remembered. I sat with what I had found for a full day before I did anything. That evening, I printed every page of all 3 vendor contracts, set them side by side on my dining room table in a row, and put our original standard template next to them. I had a handwritten note nearby from earlier that week, a vendor phone number, and a reminder to follow up, and I moved it aside to make room. I noticed my own handwriting on that scrap of paper as I set it down. I always write things down. I always keep notes. That habit goes back to the earliest days of the business, back when I was still learning what it cost to rely on memory instead of records. I started reading the contracts against the template, line by line. The commission clause was in all 3, word for word, identical across all 3 contracts. The same phrasing, the same paragraph structure, the same specific construction of the sentence that triggered the referral payment. Nothing in our standard template resembled it. This language had been drafted separately, outside our template, and inserted into all 3 agreements before they were signed. Drafted once, used 3 times. I read everything twice. Then I stopped and just sat there. In front of me, 3 contracts, our original template, and a handwritten note I had moved aside to make room for the truth. My dining room, quiet, late. 11 years of building something I cared about, spread across a table in the form of documents that had been quietly modified to route money to a firm I had never heard of until 10 minutes ago. I sat in that quiet for a long time. Not because I did not know what I was looking at. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I sat there because I was letting myself fully take in what Dana had done, not the legal facts of it, the human fact. She had sat across my desk. She had nodded. She had told me she understood why the clause was there, and then she had gone and built a structure, using a role I had given her inside something I had built to take over $1 million from me while we worked in the same building. The receipt had my name on it. The story had hers. I did not call Dana that night. I called my attorney. My attorney had been with me since the company was formed. He was the one who had drafted the original vendor agreement template. He was the one who had looked at me more than a decade ago and said most small businesses never need this when I asked for the conflict clause. He remembered putting it in. He pulled the template file that night, confirmed the language was exactly as I remembered it, and asked me to send him all 3 contracts. I sent them immediately. He called me the next morning. His assessment was careful and specific. All 3 contracts had been executed by Dana in her capacity as operations manager. All 3 contained the commission clause routing payments to the named consulting firm. Dana held a co-founding interest in that firm, a material financial interest in a beneficiary of the contracts she had personally signed. She had never disclosed that interest to the company, to me, or in any document connected to any of the 3 engagements. Under the undisclosed conflict provision in our standard vendor agreement template, all 3 contracts were voidable. Not difficult to challenge, not in a gray area, voidable, clearly and cleanly voidable. The language in all 3 is identical, he said. Yes, I said, down to the formatting. A short pause, then, she drafted this before she came to you. That was the second time during all of this that I just went quiet and let something settle over me without trying to push it anywhere. I did not argue about memory. I brought records. I want to tell you what those days felt like. The stretch between noticing that vendor address and hearing my attorney confirm what I had already worked out for myself. People sometimes assume that finding something like this produces clean, direct anger. It did not feel like that. It felt older, more layered. The kind of feeling you get when something you had chosen not to look at too directly finally stops letting you look away. I thought about the 3 weeks I had spent deciding whether to bring Dana in. I thought about every holiday dinner and every phone call and the years of warmth between us that had felt completely real to me. I thought about my husband and what this was going to do to his relationship with his sister. I thought about the people who worked for me every day, who had no idea that for 7 months, the money they helped generate was being pulled out through contracts their own manager had designed for exactly that purpose. And I kept thinking about that handwritten note I had moved aside to make room for the contracts. A phone number, a reminder, the kind of thing you leave for yourself 100 times a year and never think about twice. But it was dated. It was in my handwriting. It was real in a way that Dana's commission structure was not in any honest sense. The caregiver's log was dated. The lies were not. That is the thing about what Dana had built. It depended entirely on no one looking closely enough, on the daily noise of running a small business providing enough cover, on the idea that an operations manager's job is to simplify your life, not to give you more things to verify. She had bet on the relationship too, on the fact that I had chosen to trust her, and that choice would give her just enough protection to keep the commissions running until all 3 contract terms were complete. She had also counted on me not having documentation clean enough to act on quickly if I did notice something. That bet was wrong in every direction she could have placed it. My attorney moved carefully over the weeks that followed. He sent formal voiding notices to all 3 vendors, citing the conflict clause by section and paragraph, identifying the factual basis, and declaring each contract void. All 3 vendors received the same documentation. All 3 contracts were voided. Then he issued a formal demand letter to Dana's consulting firm for repayment of the commissions already paid. During all of this, Dana was still coming into the operations office every day. I had said nothing to her. My attorney had strongly advised against saying anything while the legal process was underway, and I agreed completely. So I showed up. I answered her work questions. I reviewed the operational items she brought to me. I sat across from her in brief check-ins and talked about vendor timelines and logistics. I gave her nothing. What I had not expected was what those weeks would show me about Dana as a professional. I had been watching her for months with a baseline level of trust. Now I was watching her with clear eyes. And what I saw was someone who was very skilled at managing upward. She brought things to my desk that looked like progress. She framed updates to make herself sound organized and on top of things. She kept a deliberate distance from any conversation that might pull my attention toward the vendor contracts themselves. At one point, she mentioned offhand that one of the 3 vendors had asked about extending the contract terms. She presented it as a good sign, a signal that the relationship was strong. I told her I would need to review the terms carefully before any extension conversation could happen. She nodded and moved on. I do not know if she caught anything in my face or my voice. If she did not show it. Some siblings do not want fairness. They want revision. Dana had been revising the story of who she was for as long as I had known her. She had a particular skill for finding the angle in any situation that cast her as the person who had given more than she received, worked harder than she was credited for, been treated unfairly by someone with more resources. I had seen her run that version of events before, with the earlier business partner, with family members who had grown tired of lending money that did not come back. I had believed versions of her story at various points in our years together. I was not going to let her build that version of this before the documentation was finished. There were evenings during that period when I sat in my home office after the house went quiet, reading the 3 contracts again. Not because I needed to, my attorney had everything. I read them because I was still trying to find the exact moment when Dana had looked at the company I was offering her access to and decided that what I was paying her was not enough. when she had decided to build a structure to extract from me quietly, in a way I was supposed to never see clearly enough to act on. That handwritten note from my dining room table was on my desk during those evenings. I kept picking it up without meaning to. A phone number. A reminder from a Tuesday afternoon like any other Tuesday afternoon. But I had kept it, the way I kept everything, dated and real. And sitting there in that quiet office reading those contracts, it felt like the most important piece of paper in the room, not for what was written on it, for what it stood for. 11 years of showing up and writing things down and keeping what I wrote, consistently, without drama. Dana had built her scheme on the assumption that I did not work that way, that I was running my company on relationships and trust and the goodwill of family, not on records. I had records going back 11 years. Then came the night before the Monday morning. The legal work was almost finished. The voiding notices were being prepared. My attorney had walked me through the final timeline. Everything that was going to happen soon. I sat in my home office late that night with the folder in front of me. The 3 voided contracts, the attorney's analysis, Dana's signed onboarding acknowledgement, the original template with the conflict clause marked, the handwritten note I had placed into the folder without quite deciding to, just set it in there where it belonged with the rest of the real things. I sat with all of it and thought about what was about to happen, not whether to do it. I had been clear on that from the moment I called my attorney. I thought about what it was going to cost in the places where money cannot reach. My husband's family. The version of Dana I had genuinely liked, the warmth I had believed was real between us, whatever that had been, it was already gone. Not because of what I was about to do, because of what she had already done. I closed the folder. I left it on the desk. I went to bed. That was the silence before the consequence. No speech, no phone calls. I just sat with what I knew and what I had documented, and I let it be what it was. My attorney and I had agreed on the timing together, methodically. Everything was in place. The voiding notices had been delivered to the 3 vendors. The demand letter had been formally issued to Dana's consulting firm. The employment termination documentation had been prepared with full HR review. Every piece was ready. Dana arrived at the operations office at her usual time. Her access badge did not work at the front door. On her desk, a member of my legal team had placed a letter from my attorney. It explained in plain and specific language that her employment was terminated effective immediately, that the 3 vendor contracts she had executed as operations manager had been voided under the undisclosed conflict provision in the company's standard vendor agreement template, that her consulting firm had received a formal demand for repayment of all commissions already paid, and that all further communications should be directed to my attorney's office. I was not there that morning. I made that choice deliberately. I had said everything that needed to be said, not in words between us, in documents. Specific, dated, legally sound documents. There was nothing left that required a conversation. She called my husband that afternoon. 2 nights before the Monday, I had sat with him at the kitchen table and shown him everything. All the documentation, the contracts, the attorney's analysis, the demand letter. I let him read it at his own pace in silence. I did not rush him or explain while he was reading. I told him I was not asking him to choose between me and his sister. I was telling him what I had found and what I had done because he deserved to know before it happened and not after. He was quiet for a long time after he set the papers down. Then he said, "She always needed more than what was reasonable." That was the truest sentence anyone said to me through all of it. When Dana called him, he told her he had read the documentation. He told her he was not going to debate it. He told her the conversation she needed to have was with her own attorney. She did not accept that quietly. Over the following days, there were messages to my husband, to at least 2 extended family members, where she described what had happened as an overreaction on my part, a misunderstanding about contract language, something I had used against her because I had never really trusted her and had been looking for a reason to remove her from the beginning. She told one family member that the conflict clause was obscure language she had never been made aware of. My attorney responded once, in writing. His note documented that the clause had been specifically identified and explained to Dana during her onboarding. He attached a copy of her signed employment acknowledgement confirming she had reviewed and understood the company's vendor contract standards. The messages to family stopped after that. The $1,150,000 in commissions already paid, the real money that had already left my operating account under the terms of the 3 contracts, was recovered over 18 months through a negotiated repayment schedule. Dana's firm agreed to the terms rather than face litigation. Every scheduled payment arrived. My attorney tracked each one. I watched my operating account come back to where it should have been, one payment at a time, over a year and a half. It was not the kind of ending that feels like winning. There was no single moment I can point to that felt like resolution. There was just a series of email confirmations, one after another, each one a small proof that the documentation had worked, that the clause had worked, that the decision I had made years ago in an ordinary afternoon in my attorney's office had done exactly what I had put it there to do. I have spent time thinking about whether I could have done anything differently. Not legally. I think the approach was right, but in the human sense. Whether I could have seen what Dana was building sooner, addressed it earlier, found a different path. The honest answer I have come to is that there probably was not one, not with Dana as she actually was, because what I understood more clearly after all of this than I ever had before is that Dana had always believed she was owed a share of other people's success, not something earned, something owed. It had been there in her family relationships for years, in her professional ones, in the pattern of attaching herself to people who had built something, and then finding the mechanism to extract value from it. Smaller versions of this had happened before. I had watched them happen and made excuses because she was family, and because I thought affection could paper over certain truths. It cannot paper over contracts. That handwritten note, the one I moved aside on my dining room table that Sunday night to make room for the 3 vendor contracts, I still have it. It sits in a folder with the voided contracts, the attorney's demand letter, the repayment schedule, and a copy of the conflict clause from the original template. I cannot fully explain why I kept a scrap of paper with a phone number on it, but whenever I look at that folder and I see the note alongside everything else, it reminds me of something I had always known but needed to understand again from a different angle at a different cost. The small things you do consistently, the records you keep, not because you are suspicious but because you are careful, the clauses you insist on because you already paid for the lesson somewhere earlier, the habit of writing things down and keeping what you wrote, those are the things that protect you when everything else fails. Not the trust you extended. Not the years of shared dinners and genuine warmth and the relationship you believed was real on both sides. Not the fact that she was family. The documentation. If you have ever given a family member signing authority in your business, did you have a conflict of interest clause in your template, or is that something you are thinking about now for the first time because this story made it land differently than any advice you have read? Leave your answer in the comments. I mean that genuinely. Because I have spoken to other small business owners since all of this concluded, and the number of people who have handed family members real authority without that kind of structural protection in place is striking. It is not about distrust. A conflict clause does not say you do not trust the person. It says you built something that can survive the moments when trust turns out to be misplaced. Those moments happen. They happen in business, they happen in families, they tend to arrive quietly. I still carry something about Dana that I cannot fully put into words. It is not clean anger. It is not grief exactly, though it has some of grief's qualities. Something in the space between knowing who a person really is and remembering who you thought they were. I do not hate her. I do not have space in my days for that. But the door between us is permanently closed, and that closure is not a punishment. It is just what I know now and what I cannot unknow, and the boundary that follows from that. And if stories like this remind you that blood does not excuse betrayal, subscribe to my channel for more stories. Because sometimes peace begins when the truth is finally spoken. Some mornings, I still picture that Monday. Dana walking up to the front door, badge in hand. The door not opening. Standing there for a moment, trying it again. The brief confusion before she found another way inside. Finding the letter on her desk. Reading it standing up, the way you read something when you already sense you do not want to sit down with it. I think about that, and then I think about 11 years of getting up early and building something I loved, carefully, honestly, with my name on every decision. I think about a quiet afternoon in a law office a dozen years ago when I said, "Put the clause in." I think about a handwritten note on my dining room table that I moved aside one Sunday night to make room for the truth. I keep records. I always have. That is enough.